Hello, everyone. In this podcast, we will be discussing sensitive topics such as sexual assault. It's important to take care of yourself while listening. Some suggestions are listening while you're in a healthy headspace or knowing who you can reach out to if you become upset. Our 24/7 helpline for crisis calls based out of Central Florida is 407-500-HEAL. By contacting the national hotline at 1-800-656-4673, you can get support and learn about your local resources. There's always someone ready to help. Welcome to the Victim Service Center podcast. Here we sit down with professionals that serve survivors and victims of trauma or those who've experienced violence and have conversations about social issues. This episode is part of a podcast mini-series for Black History Month, where we will be uplifting and highlighting conversations regarding Black communities. Today, we are talking about implicit bias. My name is Emilie Mitchell. My pronouns are she, her, and I am the education coordinator at the Victim Service Center of Central Florida. With me today, I have Undersheriff Mark J. Canty. Undersheriff Canty uses he, him pronouns and, after graduating from Northwestern University, started working in the Urban League in Orlando, which made him realize that a career in law enforcement was his calling. He has worked with the Orlando Police Department over his 22-year career and was appointed Deputy Chief in 2017. And in 2019, he was appointed Undersheriff of the Orange County Sheriff's Office. Undersheriff Canty is driven by a desire to make a bigger impact in his community and beyond by making connections with young people before they are in trouble. So Undersheriff Canty, thank you so much for being here today.
Oh, thank you for having me. It's my pleasure to be here.
I'm so excited. And I also have joining us Omar M. Bohler. Omar uses he, him pronouns and is the current Deputy Chief Probation Officer at the Florida Department of Juvenile Justice. Omar comes with over 20 years of military service experience and has been with the Department of Juvenile Justice for over 15 years. Omar conducts various trainings focusing on implicit bias and fair and equitable treatment. So Omar, thank you as well for joining us today.
Again, thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. I'm really excited to have this conversation. As everyone hopefully knows, February is Black History Month or African American History Month, which is a time to uplift and bring awareness to the history of these communities. Recently, the VSC was awarded a 2020 Table Talk grant by the Central Florida Foundation to launch a mini podcast series to come out during Black History Month to highlight and uplift conversations about issues affecting Black communities and Black survivors of trauma. On this episode, we will be talking about the difference between implicit and explicit bias, how implicit bias affects BIPOC individuals, trainings available on things like implicit bias, and how we can hold space for these important conversations to ultimately break down barriers and systemic or structural racism. So with that said, I'd like to start off if you could both briefly talk about your backgrounds a bit and what you do at your respective organizations. And we'll start off with Omar.
Yes, again, my name is Omar. I work for the Department of Juvenile Justice, Circuit 18, which is Brevard and Seminole County. And a part of my job is we deal with probation. So young people that are sanctioned by the court to be on probation, our job is to supervise that probation. So we have 7 supervisors and approximately, I would say about 50 staff throughout the Seminole and Brevard County area. So that's kind of what I do, supervise them, try to help them navigate that system, navigate the court system, work between the courts and other stakeholders, whether they be DCF, whether it be mental health professionals, to make sure the right services for the right kid at the right time. So we do that. One of my jobs, and I think is the reason for my invite, is I talk a little bit about implicit bias. because research shows in various settings, especially law enforcement, probation, and the judicial setting, that with information about implicit bias, people can actually reduce their bias. They get informed and they actually learn unique skills that help them change policies and practices. And as those people grow with the organization, they can actually influence law. So it's a longitudinal approach to dealing with structural racism, if you would. So that's one of the things, that's one of the major pieces that I am a part of. And our department just launched a program for our staff, detention and probation staff, an 8-hour curriculum on implicit bias, so they can measure themselves. So that's a little bit about what I do for the department.
Thank you so much, Omar. That sounds amazing. And I'm sure we'll delve more into exactly the trainings that you provide. Undersheriff Canty, would you be able to go a bit about your background and what you do at your organization?
Yeah, I've been in law enforcement for about the last 24 years. The first 22 of that was with the Orlando Police Department, where I rose to the level of deputy chief. And just there, a lot of the things I did was help the chief administer the agency and go through different programs. I think probably some of the programs that I was heavily involved with at the Orlando Police Department as a result to community engagement were the Coffee with a Cop program, which I started up at the Orlando Police Department as a partnership with McDonald's, and then a program we called Orlando Speaks, which was a way for citizens and officers to get together and discuss implicit bias, stereotypes, and things like that. And that was a partnership with Valencia's Peace and Justice Institute. When Sheriff Mina became the sheriff of Orange County, he asked me to come with him and be his undersheriff at the Orange County Sheriff's Office. And there, I kind of assist him with the day-to-day, where I supervise or manage about 2,500 employees, to include our administrative and operational services bureau. Then I also directly oversee our intelligence unit and Central Florida Intelligence Exchange, our strategic communications, our legal services, and our professional standards division, which is the unit that kind of takes complaints and looks at allegations of misconduct by our deputies. So I kind of have my hand in a little bit of everything. And because of my background and actually growing up here in Orange County, the sheriff leans on me a lot to kind of get my input on different programs and help his vision actually become the mission of the sheriff's office.
Thank you so much, Undersheriff Canty, and thank you, Omar, and you both for all that you do. I'm really excited to have this conversation with both of you today. And I think that it would be really helpful to start off with some definitions, as we've been throwing out things like structural racism and implicit bias. I think it's good to kind of have this foundation for everyone. So that being said, and this could be either you, Undersheriff Canty, or you, Omar, could you define bias? And is bias different from racism?
So I'll start off. And there's several different types of biases. But yes, bias is totally different than racism. A lot of people use racism as a catch-all. And bias, there's two main types of bias. There's implicit bias, and then there's explicit bias. Explicit bias is that bias that you know you have, and you act in that space knowing what you know. Implicit bias is something that's, a lot of people are not really aware of that definition, but it simply means a bias you have that you are unaware of, that you have no control of, because it is beyond your purview. And it's based on your experience. It's based on everything that has happened to you. It may even be based on vicarious experience. Maybe as a law enforcement officer, you saw something, and that something is now embedded in you. And although you have this honor to protect and to serve, that bias kind of influences things without your knowledge. So implicit bias is a little bit more, I guess, overreaching, because it has more influence over a person, and it's beyond that person's awareness. Now, the interesting thing about implicit bias is other people may know it exists, But because of the system and because of fear and whatever, it's hard for people to say, hey, I think you might be biased about this. So often that kind of fosters that person's belief to believe the space that they're operating in is okay. But other people may be drawing opinions about them without their knowledge. So again, explicit just means I know, implicit means I am unaware.
Thank you so much for that definition. I don't know if you wanted to add anything, Undersheriff Canty.
No, I think those are actually great definitions. And I think a lot of times people, they do tend to kind of misinterpret the two between structural racism or racism and bias. And I think when you think of explicit bias, that's kind of what you think of as the structural racism. You know, hey, I don't like a person because of how they look, and because of that, I take certain steps. And I think that's what the society as a whole regularly combats. The implicit bias is like you don't really understand it, or you don't really see it as much, and it may be just based on your experiences or the things you've been exposed to. You prefer one thing over another, and not really know that you're biased. So it is definitely a lot harder to see, and like Omar said, most people don't even realize that they have any biases. So it does become harder to combat.
That makes a lot of sense. I'm kind of picturing like an iceberg a little bit, like the tip of the iceberg might be that explicit bias, but underneath is that implicit bias. And you mentioning, Omar, that it's probably what we're more motivated by. It kind of makes me think of that iceberg, because that's most of the iceberg is underneath the part that we don't see.
You know, they use the iceberg theory when they're talking about trauma, because they'll say 10% of what anybody will know about you is on the surface. That 90% nobody knows about, and that's the space that we're operating in. That's the information, the stimulus that's coming in on a day-to-day basis, and that's what's controlling us. So it's really incumbent upon us to get a hold of it. Now, there is a huge difference between, as we both alluded to, between racism and implicit bias, because racism, really, it's the belief that someone else is inferior to you, or you are superior to someone else. So oftentimes, and I think we even mentioned this before, just leading up to this podcast, I think we mentioned that, people may post something and it may be a racist post, but that doesn't necessarily mean that person is racist. They may just have a bias where it flew past them and they posted, maybe it was funny to them, but it's really a racist post. So because of their lack of experience with a diverse population, they just thought it was funny, it was stereotypical, but it was a racist post. Racism really is the knowledge that somebody is inferior to you. So unless that element is there, typically it is a bias as opposed to, racism.
And it also sounds like when we talk about racism, it's more of that system, and correct me if I'm wrong, but kind of like the system that's going on, that's been around for generations and generations, of course. And then maybe the bias is maybe on the individual level. Is that kind of a better way to? Okay, got it. That makes
I think that's a good way to put it. That the racism is that structure where people are denied access to resources based on their race.
Yes.
Whereas an individual's thought may not necessarily deny you access, but when it's supported by a structure, it becomes very powerful, because everything within that structure kind of mimics or mirrors what a person believes.
Yeah, and I definitely like the way the Undersheriff framed that, because oftentimes people associate people with the structure and they're separate from that. I may operate as a teacher, but I'm not the structure. I'm not, the teaching environment. I operate as a teacher. The structure is the school system. So the school system in itself, when we talk about structural racism, the school system structurally is set up racist. And a lot of people say, well, what do you mean by that? Well, it's based on funding. School systems are funded by property tax. And areas where, high income areas, they're going to get more property tax and more funding. Now there's federal funding that's there, but the majority of funding come from property tax. So therefore, those schools in those rich areas, that structure that set that up, that said that this schools will be funded based on property tax, is systematically racist toward the population as a whole. Because those areas where there's not a lot of property base and not a lot of ownership there, then they get funded far below what their needs are. You know, there was a lot of, especially last year, not really, I didn't hear too much this year, but last winter, there was a lot related to northern school systems where they were studying with coats and mittens on in school, you know, because of the fact that, you know, the school didn't have the funding to keep the heat on or to, you know, replace heating elements. So that kind of supports the structure. When we look at also the education level of teachers, the student-teacher ratio, the funding that they pay per school or extracurricular activities, all those things are something that you see in schools with higher property tax, but you know, you don't see them in schools where the property tax is low. So what does that mean to our kids? That means that they are not having access to that, and that doesn't motivate them, you know, on a different level when we start talking about extracurricular activities, you know, pay to play, so to speak. In rich neighborhoods, that's not a problem for them. That's not even a forethought. In our poor neighborhoods, when that used to be something you can walk in and just play and get funded, now, because of how funding is done now, those kids are left out. They can't afford it. Those families can't afford it. So that's just an element. But what that means is all those teachers that's working in that element, they have a kind heart. They're motivated to do their job. They are serving as teachers. And it's interesting because it's the same element in law enforcement. You know, people, the majority of people that go into law enforcement, research shows, because they have a desire to serve. It's almost similar to the military. They have this inherent desire to work within their communities and do something great for their communities. So, but the structure is set up where sometimes law enforcement officers have to make an arrest, even if their own mind says that maybe I could probably negotiate this with the family. So that becomes the issue. So sometimes, although they're serving with an honorable heart, the system doesn't serve that law enforcement officer in the way that it should. I don't know if Undersheriff Canty can expound on that.
I think you explained it perfectly. I think we look at, particularly when you look at the structure set on a certain base of norms, and it doesn't take into cultural differences, things like that. So a lot of times our deputies and officers, their hands are tied where they could negotiate and they could find another solution, but the law dictates we operate a certain way. So I think that the school analogy is the best way to kind of show the differences and the lack of access to resources. And I think that's the big thing about racism, is it deprives somebody of access, and without that access, things are inevitably unequal. So,
absolutely.
Yeah, thank you so much both for sharing your thoughts on that. That really helps break it down. Kind of some final definitions that I'd like to discuss are, you know, racial ethnic disparities, or RED, and disproportionate minority contact, or DMC. So what are these two terms and how are they related?
So I actually serve on a racial ethnic disparity committee, and it's commonly referred to as RED, R-E-D. So racial ethnic disparity is outcomes. So racial ethnic disparity means, as an example, in the criminal justice system, if a person goes before a judge, one is Black, one is white, they have the same representation, they have the same legal background, same legal history, research shows that the person of color is going to be treated more harshly than the other person. So the outcomes are different. So that's racial ethnic disparity. Now, disproportionate minority contact just speaks upon population, meaning that, as an example, because I work in Seminole County, I use those numbers as an example. In Seminole County, a certain age group between 14 and 17, that population is about 13 to 14% Black. but they represent almost 95% of the detention population in that county. So it speaks upon population size. Although the population size is 14% Black, 13 to 14% Black, within the criminal justice continuum, it's much higher. So, and that's kind of what led me to this space, if you would, because I started working in the detention center. And just seeing the kids there, I just naturally assumed Seminole County represented I just thought it was a Black county. You know, I just left the military. I just started, one of my first jobs, like I said, was working in a detention center. I just, you know, I was living, you know, I still live in Orange County, but I was working in Seminole County. I just thought that that population in the whole county was majority Black, just based on the population within the detention center. And I found out very quickly that that was not the case. So I was surprised, shocked, and really started to work to try to understand the reasons behind that.
Yeah, I think when you look at the reasons, I think we have the same problem here in Orange County. A lot of it gets talked about how we police different area codes or zip codes, and we're driven a lot by statistics, by crime stats. So we have a lot of analysts that put a lot of work into looking at where crimes are occurring, so we can deploy our resources in the proper way. And I think this all ties back to structural racism. When you look at all that, in the areas that we tend to focus on because of crime stats are typically high crime areas, which typically are low income areas, which are typically minority or underserved communities, because they don't have the education that other places have, or they don't have the jobs or the medical services. They have all these deficiencies. So crime is a lot higher. So therefore, even though particularly like for Blacks, they're a small percentage of the overall population, but we spend a lot of time in those communities because of crime stats. And doesn't necessarily mean that it doesn't mean that Blacks, more Blacks are criminals. It just means that there's some there that commit a lot of crimes. And I think we find that a lot where in any community, probably 90% of the people are law-abiding, don't do any kind of crime, and there's a small fraction, 10% or less, that are out there committing large amounts of crime. But because of that, we respond with larger amounts of police presence in those communities. And I think that creates a lot of tension between minority communities and law enforcement.
If I can just add something to that, because the Undersheriff was right on target. The one thing I would add is community services are lacking as well. In the 80s, there became a huge legislative shift in where funding went. So they took a lot of those fundings away from communities. And the community that were hit hardest were the communities that didn't have the resources to rebound from that, didn't have the structure to rebound from that loss of services. So, it became a pay to play. Me as a child, I stopped playing sports because, the very next year we would have to pay for it. And I had a large family. My mom just couldn't pay for it. So it really hit me hard, but I thought to myself, what if that would have hit me several years earlier? What if I didn't have the friend network that we would just play pickup and stuff like that? What would I do to entertain myself? So that's the problem that we're having right now is these kids got to find a way to entertain themselves. And there's an interesting video that I saw just recently where this police officer is called because there's a complaint about these kids in the street. So the police officer comes up and immediately start questioning the young man that's playing basketball. And he says, obviously, I don't have a problem with you playing basketball. And he asked for the ball and he shot the ball. And he starts to play and mingle with the kids. And at the end of the conversation, he says again, I don't have a problem with your playing basketball, but if you could, for the sake of your neighbors, can you keep it low? You know, this is the, I guess, the problem that we're having. You know, one, it's laws. He had to respond because it was a call. Number two, this officer took a unique approach to it that he didn't have to take. You know, he came there almost, to me, almost like a dad or a coach and not a law enforcement officer. We just don't have those. One of the things that we're missing as far as service providers, because I'm a probation officer, I'm a deputy chief, but we broker services, try to get them involved in kids' lives so they won't repeat offend. And I just realized that we just don't have those services because of the lack of funding. You know, we don't have the mentors in place. We don't have the sports programs where these kids who do not have the funds to participate. Yes, there's a lot of kids that participate in them, but I'm talking about the kids that really need those services the most. We don't have those. We don't have that in place to grant them something, to give them a scholarship to play for AAU sports. Because oftentimes when law enforcement will talk to me, and we're in meetings, they know these kids because they work in the community. You know, they'll say, years ago I coached him. You know, this kid's got huge potential. You know, he's very articulate. He can communicate, but he's involved in this. So it lends to believe that even law enforcement officers know the potential of the kids in the community. The problem is the community itself, funding-wise, is not supporting it. So when we talk about structural racism, we're talking about a system that systematically advantages one population at the severe detriment of another population.
Yeah, I think that that's a great way to explain that. And in terms of, you know, when we think of, well, how can we fight against this system then? I hear a lot of terms like diversity and inclusion. So can you kind of explain the difference between these two terms and what these terms mean?
So because I'm the definition man, because I teach on this, no, seriously, because I teach on that, diversity really is how an organization looks in relationship to the community. So do you have a diverse, does your community mimic your organization as far as diversity, where we're talking about LGBTQ, whether we're talking about whites, blacks, Hispanics, Muslim population, you name it, Asian American population, does it mimic its community? Whereas diversity means that population within that organization, they may be diverse, but they may not be inclusive because those folks do not have a seat at the table when it comes to decision making. So that's the definition, you know, meaning diversity means, you know, we operate in a space that we have a diverse population within an organization. Inclusion means that diverse population has an equal say in the policies that drive that organization.
Understood. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Thank you for being here, definition man. I appreciate it.
Now, I do have a question for the Undersheriff. I know we as a department, as an agency, we monitor diversity within our organization. Does the Sheriff Department do that?
We're pretty, that's part of one, that's kind of one of the things that I look at is how do we look both internally to our own members, but also how do we look externally? I think that one of the goals of the Sheriff's Office is, like you said, we want to mimic what the community looks like. We want to try to have a balance of deputies that look exactly like the community. And I think we've done a good job of that. We've targeted, we want to hire women, we want to hire minorities, we want to hire different religious groups, different genders. We want to hire a lot of different things. But like you said, I think the key is it would be great if, you know, 23% of our agency was African American, 33% was Hispanic, and we had all these right numbers. But none of that is going to matter if none of the supervisors or managers or executives on the agency, if none of those look like the rest of the community.
Yes.
And we're only getting one perspective when it's time to make decisions or drive policy. It creates a problem. So we look at how do we look both internally, who's in the positions to make decisions and have a seat at the table. And I think that's one of the things that's been key to the sheriff is making sure that we have an inclusive group sitting at the table that's representing every member or every different type of people that we have in Orange County.
Awesome.
Thank you for asking that, Omar, and thank you for answering, Undersheriff Canty. I think that you're absolutely right. It's important to have the decision makers also reflect the community. That makes a lot of sense. We talked about how structural racism can be really harmful for racial minorities and members of the Black community. But I wanted to ask, how does implicit bias affect racial minorities and members of the Black community?
To me, it's faith in law enforcement, faith in teachers. There's a huge campaign against law enforcement right now. It's just, and I can speak from it because I'm not law enforcement. So there's a huge campaign. If you really just look on the peripheral and you look at data and statistics as to how much use of force is going on and how much use of force is not, and how much use of force or the same images get overplayed, replayed day in and day out. The interesting thing, my wife will show me something and I'll ask her, when was that? And it'd be a use of force where a law enforcement officer was just totally out of bounds, in my opinion. And come to find out, this is 2010. I'm like, I don't want to see that. That's not current. So it just gets regurgitated. And what I'm saying is the media plays in this. So it fosters a lack of faith in the agency because of how it's set up. So data and statistic does not match what law enforcement officers are doing, meaning law enforcement officers overwhelmingly are trying to do the right thing. And I have heard, and it's no different than when I was in the military, one thing we hate, any military organization hates, is when the person to the left or the right of them is not honoring the uniform that they're wearing. So that dictates how the perception of agencies and the faith of that agency and how the community is going to respond to them, So I think that's a big piece when you start talking about how does it affect? Because implicit bias, regardless whether you're white or Black, you can be affected by implicit bias and treat people of color, research shows, adversely. So you don't have to be just solely white to adversely treat people of color because of the history of racism, because of it was taught in schools that Blacks were inferior. They had studies, people, whether they treat teachers, preachers, chronologists, they all taught that people of color was subhuman. So that history still permeates throughout the system today. So people still have that antiquated view. So if you see on TV and you see crime statistics that show Blacks doing something at 40% rate, when you look at crime statistics on the average news station, they will depict Blacks as the perpetrator 42% of the time. But crime statistics are only showing that they're perpetrators 12% of the time. So you inherently start to believe that they're going to be, the perpetrator, even though in the US, that population is only anywhere on a given day to 13 to 14% of the population, the US population. So media is feeding to that. And I know it's ratings, but it's at the detriment, again, structural racism at the detriment of that population.
I think that's exactly, I think the way things get portrayed a lot of times aren't necessarily how they are in reality. And I think some of the things that we've tried to do is we changed our media relations section. We've changed it from that title to strategic communication. And we did that because they're not just going to respond to what the questions the media has or what the media is looking at. It's about crafting messages and showing the public, particularly with the advent of social media and how prevalent it is, showing the public exactly what we really do. So we have tons of stories that show. Some that come to mind is like there's a picture on our social media where a deputy comes in contact with a citizen that's in an electric wheelchair, and his wheelchair stops working, and the deputy is pushing him across the parking lot in the heat of the day. That's not newsworthy.
Heat of the Florida day.
Heat of the Florida day. No one's gonna. I mean, unfortunately, that's not a news story.
Yeah,
but that's what happens. Or you'll see deputies that go to someone's house. They get called to a house for someone who's having issues with their plumbing, which is not a law enforcement issue. But they get there and they see this, and it's an elderly woman with young grandkids who don't have a working toilet. They go to the store and they buy the things necessary to include a toilet, and they come back and they fix her toilet, you know, or they see an 80-year-old man in the heat of Florida summer cutting his grass, and they stop and they cut his grass for him. So those are the things that you never see, but those are the reality of what law enforcement does. And those aren't the good stories, but those are the reality. And then they don't take the data. They'll take specific stories that they want, that they know will get ratings, and they never report them. So we've tried to put all our data out there. All of our deputy involved shootings are on our website, so you can see who our deputies are using deadly force against, and it would tell a different story than what gets portrayed in the media. So all that data is available. We put it all out there. We've done a lot to try to craft our own messages to kind of combat, you know, the way that society tries to put communities against law enforcement. So,
and I think overwhelmingly society is driven by conflict and not the good stories. Right. You know, social media is driven by conflict and not the good stories. You know, it's hard to ask somebody who serves for the purpose of serving their community to Instagram a picture of them doing a good deed, because they just don't want to do it. You know, I'll see something, I'll say, hey, you need to send that to our communication center. And they may not even send it, you know, because of the fact that they do this job because they love the job, you know. So
it's very difficult to get our deputies to take pictures of themselves doing the good work, because they're not doing the job to get credit on, you know, the 11 o'clock news. They're doing the job because they want to help the community, to make a positive impact on the community. So it's very difficult to, like, hey, while you're doing that, take a picture, you know, or like, hey, you know, call us and let us know when you're having an event. Call us and let us know so we can come out to this event. It's very hard for them to. And the other thing I just want to do too is we have policies in place that kind of dictate how our deputies act. We have a bias-free policing policy that talks about not treating minority groups or protected classes any different than they would treat any other person. And then I think if we do, that's a violation of our policy, and we will discipline people that violate the policy. And I think the message that we send to our deputies, and I know the sheriff says it in every time he meets with the deputies, every time he does a training class with the deputies, is, you know, treat everybody with dignity and respect. Everybody, because you don't know their life. You don't know that the hardships that they've gone to. And if you immediately take away that their dignity, they're not going to cooperate with you. You're not going to be able to build a rapport that is going to allow you to get to the best resolution. So.
Yeah, when a person has nothing, the only thing they have is their dignity, and they'll defend that to the bitter end.
Right, absolutely.
That makes a lot of sense. And I know that we've been talking a lot about the difference between structural racism and individual racism, but I wanted to know if we could maybe lean into that a little bit. And when it comes into play when training people on implicit bias and anti-racism. So how does this difference between structural racism and individual racism come into play when training people on implicit bias?
I think when you train people, I think it's incumbent to have an open dialogue in the training, because this is a very uncomfortable subject. So you have to start off by letting people know. You also have to let people know that those who do not have what we believe is mainstream, whatever that may be, that they're free to have that conversation as well. So long as it's respectful because it allows us to learn, understand, and provide information. And not only that, that may be valuable for us because of the fact that if I don't believe what you believe, there may be components of what you're saying that may be true. So I may have to change how I perceive you just based on that story that you shared. I always say in training, especially with a topic that's difficult, especially implicit bias, you can only combat something you disagree with your own story. So how can you have this dialogue? And implicit bias is that type of training that should always lend to personal stories. I tell a lot of personal stories in implicit bias, and I encourage folks to tell those same stories and videos and conversation, and the curriculum should support that. It should be in there, embedded in that training, so people don't just walk away with definitions and say, this is a definition of anchoring bias, and this is what I believe. They should walk away with individual stories that gives a scenario that may be common to their own. So I think our training, anybody's training, and research shows this, that type of training, because of the intensity of the subject, requires open dialogue. And we can even do it, via telecommunication. We use chat features, we use breakout groups, you name it. And it fosters that dialogue, and it makes people think differently. I have an interesting story. I have a good friend of mine. I grew up in inner city Detroit. And what a difference 4 blocks make. I lived in a very poor neighborhood, and he lived in a very well-to-do neighborhood. And Mike, I called his mom and dad, and Mike was white. And he called my mom. And we were best friends from the point I was able to leave my block and play with him in his neighborhood. And we remain good friends today. I stood up in his wedding, you name it. And one time, a couple years ago, just before the pandemic, we were having a conversation. He had picked me up. I was home visiting, and I was with him and his wife. And the conversation turned, and we were talking about everything that was going on in the world. And this is before 2020. And he has a very strong opinion toward racism. He hates it. But he was sharing something about a figure that he's endured to that I have an opposing view to. And everything he was saying was an emotional conversation as to why he liked this person. And I shared with him my dismay based on personal stories, based on articles, based on court documents that I was showing him on my phone. It's readily available. Video statements, readily available. And then his eyes got huge like saucers. And he says, I never knew this. And it hit me like a ton of bricks. And I said, hey, Mike, why should you know this? It doesn't affect you. Every day I live this life. I can't take off a uniform at 5 o'clock and not be an officer. I'm Black 24/7, So I said, I don't get mad at you because you don't understand it. You have the ability to turn the channel. I can't turn the channel because some of that stuff affects me, So for him, it was kind of an eye opener for him. How do you believe something someone tells you when all you've been fed is a lie? So it's kind of hard for you to even conceptualize that. So every time you see something that's against that, they call that confirmation bias. You just turn it off because it doesn't suit your need. And you're not really exposed to it to even have a need for that. So I think that's a big part of, us having that conversation, having that training environment where people can be open and free and learn something. I learned something from him, from that conversation as well. And I think it's important to respect everyone's point of view.
Yeah, I think I love the way that you described privilege there, the privilege to be able to turn the channel. I think that that's a beautiful way to describe it. And I wanted to ask you, Undersheriff Canty, could you shed light on how implicit bias is talked about within law enforcement? I know we talked a little bit about different policies that you hold there, but I wanted to see if you could shed light on a little bit more, if you had anything to share.
It's a very difficult conversation, particularly if people don't understand or recognize that they could have implicit bias. And I remember during the Ferguson riots that things had kind of started to change here, even here locally, where we did have some protest here, and we had a lot of town halls where we would go out and we would listen to the community, or we would go out and we would have kind of, hey, this is what we're doing. These are all the numbers. This is why we do what we do. And the community would respond. It was like, well, you're not doing this, or you're treating this way. And then we would immediately say, well, we are doing this. And we would get into these back and forth where nobody was listening. I mean, I was hearing you and you were hearing me, but we weren't sitting back and really taking time to see what the real problem was. So I called those initial town halls. They were moderately effective because they gave people an opportunity to be heard, but it didn't really advance where we were going. And then we kind of fast forward. We got an opportunity to come up with an idea where we were going to sit officers down with people in the community and listen to them and talk about bias. And when I first heard it, I was like, there's no way that this is going to happen. This is impossible. And you're never going to get law enforcement officers to talk about any type of bias or any type of stereotypes or any type of that, because you're going to put them in a light that all law enforcement officers are racist. But I took a leap of faith and we continued with the program. And we had officers that agreed to participate voluntarily. And I think when you set some guidelines and you actually listen to people tell their stories, not say what they heard somewhere else, tell what their experiences are, and you're sitting there listening to them, it becomes very powerful. Because when you hear somebody talk about how they were treated by another law enforcement officer or agency and how it makes them feel, and you see the emotion in their face, it's very difficult to listen to, because you almost see them going back to that moment. And I think it's the same thing for law enforcement officers when people hear them talk about going on a call and not knowing if they're going to go home after that call, if they're going to survive that call. And I think listening to that, when you really listen, you don't make any judgments. You let people tell their story, you listen intently, and you hear that. I think that is the way we move, the dial forward. And that's the way we connect with people. And then at the end, you'll see that a lot of the desires of the community and the desires of law enforcement are the same. Every law enforcement officer wants to go home the same way that they came to work. They want to go home safely to their family. Every person who leaves their house in the morning to go to work, to go to school, to go to the grocery store, they want to come home safely. Those are the same. They want to be safe in their communities. Everybody wants to be respected. As a law enforcement officer, when I go to a call, I want people to listen to me, do what I'm asking them, things like that. Same thing when the community, when I come in their house, even though I'm there for a problem, they still desire and want me to respect them as a person. And the moment that I don't do that, like Omar said earlier, if you take somebody's dignity away, they're going to fight you, because that's all they have. So you have to kind of move it forward. And I think that's where we've tried to go with law enforcement, is have our people take a little more time, listen to what people are saying, put yourselves in their shoes. And I tell our deputies all the time when I talk to them, is like, police in a way, or do your job in a way that if your mother or whoever's important in your life, if they were watching you, would they be proud of the way you're handling this? And if you can't say yes, if this is if this was gonna embarrass my mom, or she's gonna tell me don't talk like that or don't do this, then I'm probably doing the wrong thing, and I should change how I act. So I think it's the simple way to have these conversations is, don't have any judgment, tell your own story, don't get involved in what you heard or what you saw on TV or any of that. Tell what your experience is and tell how you feel when you go through that, and then listen to people and just take it in and don't judge them, and just kind of put yourselves in their shoes. And I mean, that's what we've tried to do in law enforcement is do more training like that, where we're having people come in and telling their stories, and not only let them tell their stories, but also let law enforcement tell how they feel. So
sounds like a really powerful moment. It sounds like I'm really glad that that event was able to happen. That sounds like it was.
And I think the sheriff says something too. Is like it's hard to hate somebody from 2 feet away. When you're talking and I go up to you and say, "Hey, my name is Mark," and you say, "Hey, my name is Omar," and then you talk. It's harder to hate somebody because now I'm not dealing with the stereotype that I thought, or what I or the bias that I knew, or what I any kind of impression I had before. I'm dealing with the person 2 feet away, and I need to deal with them and not think about the other stuff. So
right, yeah, and I love that these trainings are available at the sheriff's office. That being said, are these kind of a relatively new type of training? Do you think this is kind of a new conversation, or has this been around for a while?
I mean, when I went to the academy, 20 plus years ago, we did human diversity type training, which focused a lot on racism and prejudice and things like that. I think as times go on, these classes they improve, they evolve. I think they're getting better, and they're having some of those more difficult conversations. And I think that's where it is. But they've been around for a long time, but I think they're just evolving more. And I think one of the key components of it is we're starting to talk about the history. And when you start talking about that piece, because anybody will say like, well, I wasn't alive during the civil rights movement, so I have nothing to do with that. Or I wasn't alive during Jim Crow, so I didn't have anything to do with that. Or I wasn't alive during slavery, so that I didn't have anything to do with that. But when you start piecing it back and you look at how law enforcement has been used by society to enforce these policies, so they were used in the Jim Crow era to enforce segregation, because that was the law of the land. So there are still people today that tell stories to their families about how law enforcement was involved in that. And it wasn't necessarily the thought of everybody in law enforcement, but that was the law of the land. That's what society wanted us to do. And I think, unfortunately, at times law enforcement, even today, we're still used. Like I know Omar talked earlier about when you don't have these resources, these community resources, people call the police. They call law enforcement, and it's not a law enforcement concern. When someone's plumbing is out in their house, I'm not a plumber. I can't, but they don't know what to do. And the only 24-hour, one of the few 24-hour, 7-day-a-week institutions is law enforcement. So they call for help. And we come and, we try to help or do what we can, but they're always not law enforcement problems. So.
Absolutely. I think that it makes a lot of sense that there's kind of more conversations going around regarding implicit bias. Omar, are you seeing that as well on your end, or are more people reaching out to you for trainings due to recent events than they normally would?
I have been crazy busy for the last, 12 months, but when I first came to the department, even in the military, training related to diversity was very sterile. It was all in definition based, and that's what you got. It was much shorter. It had no stories related to it. So that's all it was, so people left out of there wanting and, left with, more confusion than they did when they walked in. So I think now people are having scenario-based, they're bringing data into it, they're bringing conversations, breakout groups and stuff like that. So they're really, and they're using current events. Yes, they're talking about history, but they're drawing a line with history to current events. So it's really, people almost can see it real time now. They can see the value of history and how we have perpetuated the same things. It's almost like the financial industry. There's three major times that we had a financial crisis. That was the Great Depression, the savings and loan debacle in 1985, and then we had the Great Recession in 2007, which most people would say is still going on. The interesting thing is that they mimic each other and what caused them, deregulation, our thought that the institution would be faithful and trickle down economics, as Reagan would say, would help. And none of that worked. We continue to do that to our peril. So the same thing with riots and peaceful protests and racism. Every administration has saw this. Every administration. And the failure in every administration was we failed to reconcile our past. We don't even teach it in schools. Matter of fact, there's at least 3 states that are in courts trying to dilute or take out our history, those for people who are of color, out of their history books. So the only difference is now all cultures are wanting to know this. It wasn't just earlier because of how it was taught. Blacks were the only one that's really craving what is our history, because of the fact that this is what people are saying, what is our true history? As years went on, we started to find falsehoods in that early doctrine that we were exposed to. But now everybody wants that information. So that becomes the narrative today. People are now drawing that direct line to history and how it continues to replicate itself, and they're wanting to change. So, when I go into conversations now, as opposed to when I did it several years ago, I say there is no better time for us to have this conversation, because people are really, it's almost like they're drug addicts wanting more information on bias and how do I treat my neighbor fair? Whether he be white, whether he be black, whether he be this person use a different pronoun, how do I just treat them fair? In a system that systematically itself across every system, whether it be the job market, whether it be the dependency system, the criminal justice system, the healthcare system, all these systems, housing system, treat people of color differently. So how do I bridge the gap and at least have the conversation that I acknowledge that you're treated differently? So therefore, the knowledge of that will allow me to do better with my own behavior.
Absolutely. And I'd like to lean in a little bit on your training specifically, Omar. I know we kind of talked a little bit about sharing stories and those kinds of things. What have you found to be helpful in your trainings and not helpful when teaching on implicit bias?
Let me start with not helpful, because the Undersheriff mentioned it. When we defend ourselves and our system, we create a quagmire of defensiveness. So people are there to tell their story. We shouldn't defend our system. We should just tell our story as it relates to, because the system we already know is broken. So the only thing we can do is tell our story within the system. I'm sorry for what happened to you. When I go out, this is what I try to do. And I try to treat everybody fair. I have kids myself. I grew up in this environment. I see the value in every family I come across. So when you tell your story and tell a particular story about you helping a family and how that impacted you, how their acceptance to your assistance impacted you, that's powerful. When you defend it, then they tell you another story then they start telling you other people's stories. They completely lose sight, of the game plan. So it's about having, as again, Undersheriff said, you got to have guidelines to the conversation. You got to let them know, one, it's going to be difficult. The guideline is we're going to operate on storytelling, your personal story, not a story of a friend or a friend of a friend. And we can discuss something that's even in the media, but we're going to discuss it in the context that it's the media event and maybe it has not fully matured yet. So we can broach that, but we're going to mainly focus on stories. So we operate from that, and we'll operate from the fact that this is just the jump off point. We're not going to solve everything here, but when we leave, hopefully we have a sense of respect from each other, and that respect will build and almost be infectious to others because we'll learn how to communicate. So, once you have those rules, those are the things that work, having those rules and what those rules mean. Again, what doesn't work is defensiveness and defending a system that we know has failed people. You can defend yourself as a person that operates in that system, but please don't defend the system because that'll be problematic, because then they just turn off. Then you get more defensive, about a system that we all know it's not 100% fail safe.
Yeah, absolutely.
We know that there's things within the system that works.
Right.
But we know that there's things that the community do not like that systematically oppresses them. So we must be okay with the fact that we allow them to speak their truth. But we have to also have the courage to speak our truth as an individual officer or as an individual probation officer, law enforcement officer, and the type of scenarios we've been in, whether they were hurtful to us, whether we walked away and had to, share with our wives to really purge ourselves of that incident. Those are the type of stories that relate us to them and them to us. they need to be able to see me be without the badge. And when they see me as a human and not as a star, then I've made a connection.
Absolutely. I think that these are really important conversations that, like you mentioned, can be really difficult and really uncomfortable. But it seems like they're conversations that we need to have as a society in order to end things like systemic racism. And you talked a little bit about some of these rules. And I wanted to ask both of you, if you had any other rules or guidelines that people should abide by when they have these conversations. And what I really wanted to ask is, do these kinds of conversations take multiple tries to actually have a difference?
Yes. It's almost like playing a game of darts. The first time you throw that dart for the very first time, if you never played darts before, you're going to hit the wall. So you're going to be nowhere near the bullseye. So the more you have, the more you can tweak what you have to do in your agency, in your organization, in your town, in your community. Because what works for one community may not work for another community because the makeup, the system, the population is different. So that's number one. And to me, the second thing is you have to encourage people to gauge their own implicit bias, meaning they have to take a test to see where they land on that scale. I was completely shocked about my level of bias when I took the Harvard implicit bias test, which is probably the most prominent implicit, because it monitors implicit associations that people are unwilling or unable to admit that they have. So when I took that, I was surprised at what my biases are. And I was in the military. I traveled all over the world. I was, in a diverse population. I thought I was free of bias. Boy, was I wrong. Day one after birth, you are biased. So that's one thing somebody has to do. They have to gauge their own bias. They have to be encouraged that, hey, if you're going to attend this event, we just ask you to consider these tests that gauge your bias. So you know what space you're operating in when you come to the training. So we often allow people to do that. They don't have to, but other folks will be there to speak about how they were right on or how they disagree with the bias test because they said that they, preferred white people even though they were Black, or vice versa. I prefer Black people even though I'm white. So some of those things will come out in a good conversation if you start to ask the right questions. So you have to also have question starters, questions that allow people to speak freely. Your rules will foster the ability for your participants to answer the questions. And then as those questions mature, you're going to have to shut this thing down because people are really going to start to get involved in the conversation if you structure it right. But like I said, I like what you said about, does this take multiple tries? Because yes, it does. I mean, you go in there the first time, and if it just blows up in your face, oftentimes people say, I'm done with this. It's not going to work. But if you continue to do it, you'll see the change. Because we've had these, I've been part of probably about 10 of them so far. And each one gets better. Some of them, revert, but they all have nuggets that we've taken out of them that allow us to do better the next time or have more forethought in the next conversation.
Yeah, I think the rules. I mean, and I know a lot of different groups have different rules. For me, I think this. I like to go simple, and I think if you treat people how you want to be treated, I think that's the easiest. I mean, so when I'm talking, I don't want to be interrupted. I want to get my full thought out. When I'm done, I don't want it to be judged. I want people to kind of take in what I say and respect my feelings. So I think if you treat people like you want to be treated, I think that's the simplest rule that you can have. And obviously, it's good if people doing training have a lot of written out guidelines. I think that just spells it out for people, but that's the easiest way. As far as this being ongoing, I think we're in this position because of hundreds, thousands of years of people being people. So yeah, we have to continue the training. I think, and I kind of like to use an analogy. Each training is money in the bank. So when I was doing Coffee with a Cop, it was kind of always like, or even some of the other programs, hey, yeah, we did one in January, but something happens in March. People have forgotten about what we did in January. We have to continuously show that wasn't a one-off. This is who we are as an agency or as a group, and we're not just going to do it, once a year or twice a year or whenever there's a problem. We're committed to the change, and we're doing it day in and day out. We're always doing something little, and I have written up I have a garage gym, and I have written on my board in the garage gym, do something every day to get better. And that's what we have to do. Every day as a law enforcement officer, I have to do something to show the community that I'm better. Now that might be having a big class. That might be having a turkey giveaway during Thanksgiving for an underserved community. It might be playing basketball in the street, with kids. It might even just be waving as I drive by. All those things are putting money in the bank for when something happens. People have faith in our agency, and I think you can look at how things have changed over time. If you look at the George Floyd incident, people watch that. Law enforcement officers watch that on video, and to my knowledge and my experience, I've never seen so many law enforcement leaders come out immediately and condemn the actions of those involved. That never happens. And I think it's because we have moved, we've moved the needle a little bit further, where now they're saying like, hey, we're not going to wait for an investigation, because that was clearly outside of what a law enforcement officer should do. And then to see someone actually lose their life on video when they did not have to is powerful. And I think it shows how law enforcement has become more empathetic to the community, and we're changing. It's a slow process, but we're changing. So I think every day we're doing something to get better. We're nowhere near being done with this training, this kind of evolution. This will be for the rest of my career, the rest of our newest deputy. It'll be the rest of his career, and the people that come on after him. We'll be doing this as long as we're in the business of having law enforcement.
I love that you brought up the doing something every day. I think that's a wonderful thing to live by in terms of this conversation. And thank you, of course, for bringing up recent events and George Floyd and sharing your thoughts on that as well. Very important part of this conversation. I know, Omar, you talked about the Harvard implicit bias test, which is really cool. Is that a thing that we can, that anyone can take, actually?
Yep, you can take it for free, and it gauges your bias on several different levels. There's multiple ranges. I can't remember it. I took it 10 years ago. I actually took it a couple of months ago too. So, and it's a type of test that it's timed. So therefore it limits your ability to falsify the test. You know how you probably try to think as to the proper way to answer, to seem like you're not biased. Well, you can't do that during this test. The way it's structured, the way it's timed in between, the way those images come across, you don't have time to do that. It's based on your impulse. So to me, it's probably, I've taken that one, and I've taken, I think it's one out of Georgetown, but this one just seemed like it was more valid. It has more time under study as well. And it's so valued, and people are taking it every day. So it has a huge data pool to drive from.
Very cool. Yeah, I asked that because, if someone wanted to learn more about implicit bias, I think that might be a good place to start. But do you have any other places or any resources that someone can kind of start off with if they're feeling kind of like, I want to learn about my implicit biases, or I want to have these conversations, where they can go?
I would point them to the Orange County Sheriff Department's website. I mean, they have some great data there. I would point them to the Department of Juvenile Justice website. Great data there on the statistics, the makeup of communities and stuff like that. If you want to learn about implicit data within law and healthcare, I would look at our state agencies. Do a very good job of data pooling. If you would just look at the data, it gives you talking points. They have papers that they write, these the folks that's in the data and research sections, that really spell out what that data means. So for the Department of Juvenile Justice, you just go to the website, go to the research tab, and it has a racial ethnic disparities page, where it has the state of Florida, and you can hover over different counties and find the demographics and find the statistics related to the disparities in that particular county. So it's interactive is what it is. Like I said, other agencies, the health department has a very good website as well. Other states have a good website. NC Creed, which is, I think it's nccreed.com.
Even just some of our institutions of higher learning, I know Valencia is heavily involved in training people, and they do seminars. I think they have I think they call it Peace Week, where they go out throughout the county at multiple campuses across Orange and Osceola counties to do these trainings for their students and others. But I think there's a lot of people out there that are talking about this. So
now UCF is developing a curriculum specifically for either implicit bias or diversity and inclusion. I went to Cornell. They have a great diversity and inclusion program there as well. So Georgetown has one, and they're not that long. Probably some of them are about 6 classes for the certificate. Georgetown has a certification program. Cornell University has a certificate program. And like I said, UCF is in development of a program, because I was contacted by one of their professors there.
Very cool. Awesome. I really appreciate you sharing all those resources and everything. I know there's a lot out there right now, but I think those are kind of great places to start if people just want to start having this conversation. Did you find, is it NC Creed?
Let me see. That's the North Carolina Center for State Courts.
Awesome. Very cool. Yeah, we can put that in the description as well. With that being said, I think that's kind of a great place to sign off, kind of these different resources that people could start with. But before I do, is there anything else you would like to bring up that we may have not addressed in this conversation?
I do. I want to talk a little bit about microaggressions. So microaggressions are those those expressions that a person gives to another person. Procter and Gamble has an awesome diversity and inclusion program. Matter of fact, in 2018, they had a diversity and inclusion. They had several commercials that come out. You can actually go on YouTube and look up diversity and inclusion Procter and Gamble, and these awesome videos. They actually, as a part of their own program within their organization, they use these videos as vignettes, and they have discussions about them. But microaggressions is one video that they have there that really illustrates microaggressions. But microaggressions take less than a half a second to have. People who experience a microaggression cannot tell you what just occurred, but they can truly tell you their feelings how it made them feel. So that's what microaggression. They happen. That person who gives it don't even know they gave it. So it happens that quickly, and they mask it with another facial expressions to really try to cover it up. But those are very damaging to the person. If you're a law enforcement officer and you're surprised by something and you give a microaggression, which is a nonverbal body language, and nonverbal body language has a more profound effect than your verbals. Verbal communication is only 7% of communication. Nonverbal is 93% of communication. So that's the tone of my voice. That is my body language, how my body moves, how I react to the stimulus. So, that microaggression is a part of that nonverbal. So that has a more powerful effect. If I can be excited, I can say I'm excited, but not convey it physically. And so people don't believe me, I can say I want to protect and serve, but if I'm not excited about my job, I might want to reevaluate that and think about another opportunity, so I think microaggressions are very powerful, and a lot of people don't know that can influence a conversation. You go to my staff meet a kid for the very first time in the family, and they act like they're disgusted, about the family circumstance. And long before they know why they're in that circumstance, they're disgusted about the circumstance. I don't know, maybe there's a reason to be that way, but when you show that microaggression, that family lose faith in you.
Thank you for bringing up microaggressions. Always an important topic to bring up when we talk about things like implicit bias. I don't know if there's anything that you wanted to add to anything that we may not have addressed under Sheriff Canty.
I just want to say that the vast majority of law enforcement officers out there are in this for the right reason. I think everybody we hire is a reflection of our society, and these men and women that put on the uniform and put on the badge, they're dedicated to putting their lives in danger to keeping this community safe. And unfortunately, there are a few that have different motives. And that's a small percentage that have different motives, and they get corrupted by the idea of power, and they use some of their explicit biases at work. That's the few. And when we find out who those people are, when they make it known to us who they are, we take the appropriate steps to get them out of this profession. Because I can't tell you the number of times I've been on calls and I've seen officers and deputies put their lives in the lines for total strangers. And I will bring up the Pulse nightclub incident because it's very, it was a big event for this community. We didn't know who we were going to help. And I think over 27 law enforcement agencies responded to that event. They didn't know who was inside. They didn't know who the victims were. They didn't know any of that. They knew that people were calling for assistance, and those law enforcement officers and other first responders responded there immediately, putting their lives in possible danger to make sure that we could save as many people as possible. And I think that is what law enforcement is truly about. That is what the men and women of the Orange County Sheriff's Office represent, or any other law enforcement agency. They are truly here to serve the community, make a positive impact, and do the right thing every day. said, when those few show themselves, show their negative actions and their biases and their racist undertones, we act swiftly and strongly to get them out of our profession. So the men and women of law enforcement are definitely here to support and protect this community.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, both you, Undersheriff Canty, and you, Omar. I think that's a wonderful place to sign off. So thank you to the listener for listening to the Victim Service Center podcast. The VSC is a nonprofit organization that provides free, confidential counseling services for victims of any kind of trauma in Central Florida. To learn more about our services, please visit victimservicecenter.org. And to everyone listening, healing is not linear and you are not alone. And thank you so much again, Omar and Undersheriff Canty, for joining me today.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
My pleasure.